first learned about James Wilt, early in the pandemic when Free Transit Edmonton, shout out to a couple of the former, or the current Free Transit Edmonton representatives. Free Transit Edmonton put on this webinar all about how transit should be free, but not just free, but good. And James's talk was inspiring, and I hoped one day to meet him. And then when I got elected to council, I kind of cold called him and said, I'm a humble city councillor from Edmonton, I'd love to meet you. And like maybe one day I could bring you to Edmonton, and he just DM'd me back and said, yeah, let's chat. And I've been so impressed with his generosity, his kindness, his thoughtfulness, and not just his first book on transit, but his second book on alcohol policy, because James is really diving into these difficult conversations about what we should be doing, what is in the public interest, what is in the common good. And I'm so happy that all the way from Treaty 1 territory, James Wilt is here to join us, to inspire us to dream bigger about public transit. Over to James Wilt. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Amazing. So yeah, thank you so much. This is incredible. My name is James Wilt. I'm a PhD candidate and writer based in Winnipeg in Treaty 1. And I am deeply grateful to be here today in Treaty 6 to hang out with you all. I want to dwell a bit more on that fact that all of these conversations that we're having today are happening on Indigenous land. And that settler colonialism is not just a thing of the past, but it's an ongoing process, and it's essential that we actively commit to its undoing it every day. And I think this is especially worth reflecting on, given that a majority of people who are unhoused and criminalized and incarcerated and displaced from public spaces, including transit stations, are Indigenous. But it's also Indigenous organizing and resistance that's leading the way in fighting for a more just and livable world. Special thanks to Councillor Jans for organizing this event, for all the groups that have made this happen. And I'd also like to extend my solidarity to DATS drivers who are fighting for wage parity with conventional transit. This is a really crucial labor and disability justice struggle that we should all be supporting, everyone today. So before I move on, this is a real tweet. I don't think Elon Musk knows about my book, which is named the same thing. He tweeted it out of the blue, but I thought it would be nice to start with that. My book is titled Do Androids Dream of Electric Cars? Public Transit in the Age of Google, Uber, and Elon Musk. And this is actually the first in-person book event I've ever had for this transit book, because the book was published in April 2020, about a month after COVID hit North America in force. So it's a really huge honor and privilege to speak with you today after almost 3 years after the book came out, and the size of the enthusiasm that's probably makes up for it in many ways. So at the start of the book, I noted that ridership declines in the U.S. especially were a sign of public transit being in bad shape. And so this is a chart that kind of shows transit ridership change between 2016 and 17, and the average decline in the U.S. was 6% between 2014 and 17. You'll see the Canadian cities listed on the right-hand side. So between that time, Canadian transit systems in urban areas of million were actually increased by 1.3, led by Vancouver. But for the most part, this was a steady decline. So I talked in the book, at the start of the book, this 6% decline was really concerning for transit advocates. But then, of course, COVID went and wiped out 70 to 80% of transit ridership, which nobody could have predicted. So it kind of it's not like the 6% concern was wrong, it was just, this really put it into a far more dire context. And I don't really sound like a marketing gimmick, but I think that a lot of the arguments I make in the book are still relevant, arguably even more so today, even though the conditions have changed quite significantly. So I do want to congratulate Edmonton for being the first major city in Canada to recover 100% of bus ridership. And I think that's a testament to maintaining bus service throughout a lot of the pandemic. Many other cities out from Winnipeg, and this includes Winnipeg, responded to the pandemic with mass layoffs, service cuts, at a time when overcrowding was a more serious threat than ever before because people wanted to socially distance. And these decisions have had reverberations to this day. And the city constantly feigns shock about why ridership revenue has failed to rebound the same way sense of Edmonton. So that's awesome, and it also sounds like Calgary is close to reaching pre-pandemic levels, perhaps by the end of the year, so that's great news. I also want to shout out all the transit workers, especially following what Mayor Sohi said, who have endured a great deal during this pandemic, to continue providing service for us all. So thank you so much. So this is the slightly less exciting reality, is that while it's really impressive and important that we have regained the ridership that was present before the pandemic hit, so-called normal times are still not great when it comes to transit usage. A large majority of people still rely on private automobiles to get around for most, if not all, tasks. And there's a lot of diversity between cities, of course, but these two graphs kind of show some of the key features that we can see in Canada, is that in 2016, the last year that we have stats, or at least that I can find stats, only 16.3% of commuters in Canada use transit as their main mode of transportation, and that's up from 13.9% in 1996, so there's a slight improvement, but 16.3% is still not a huge number. And then in the bottom graph, you'll see, again, that it is different from city to city. So for example, in Toronto, 24.3% of commuters use transit, and then there's another 6.7% who use active transportation. But even in the best case scenario in Toronto, it's still just under 1/4 of commuters who use transit. And then there have been significant increases in ridership in the 3 big cities in Canada, so Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto. But smaller cities, Edmonton included, have struggled, not for reasons that I'll get into in a second. And of course, these conditions often tend to be greatly heightened for people living in even smaller municipalities or rural and remote regions. And so the main point that I want to stress is that I don't believe that the situation is inevitable. To echo David's comments before, there are really important improvements being made that we need to celebrate and to recognize. I also don't think it will be easy or simple to confront these conditions that lead to 70–80% of commuters using automobiles to get around. But there is a tendency to attribute, say, high transit usage in Asia or Europe or Latin America to some sort of cultural predisposition. And I do think that culture plays a role, of course, including in the ideology of automobility. But we really do need to focus on the politics and economics at play too, because it's through these struggles that other places have managed to get the amazing systems that they have today. So just a brief outline of presentation structure. So firstly, I will follow some of the comments that Mayor Sohi was making about the benefits that transit can bring, but also the limitations in automobile-centric cities. And given the nature of this event, I'm going to assume that a lot of people are on the same page, or at least recognize some of these issues. So I won't go too into detail into them, but it is helpful to remember some of these main benefits, because they're often ignored or neglected or not fleshed out fully when we're making these sorts of decisions or having these conversations. So secondly, is going to be a couple of reflections on what it would take for transit to become the preferred mode of transportation along with active transportation. I know that this will echo some of the things that have been previously said in the 2 previous presentations, and some of these things may be obvious to many, but again, it's important for us all to get on the same page about the circumstances which may limit ridership in some places and why we can fight to build a better one. And then finally, I will work to identify what I think is the biggest limitation to achieving these sort of benefits. And I won't spoil it now, but as you may already suspect, it does have something to do with money, as has been brought up earlier. So yeah, let's start with the first section on the harms of automobility and the benefits of transit. Now I'll start by acknowledging that yes, transit is far from perfect on many of the issues I'm going to talk about, but what I'm most interested in, and what I think we should be organizing around, is its potentiality. So many of the reasons that transit has fallen behind on this potential is because of chronic austerity and lack of prioritization of transit, not something inherent to the mode itself. And I don't think this is the case for private automobiles, which I think are very spatially limited in their form. We'll talk about that more in a second. Sorry for all these nauseating graphs, but I just want to give some images to sort of support what I'm talking about. So the first of four things, the benefits I'm going to talk about is climate and environment. So along with the oil and gas industry, transportation is the leading cause of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada and many other countries. And a good chunk of this is from freight and commercial, as you'll see in the bottom graph, but there's also significant contribution from passenger vehicles and airplanes, which I think are intimately related to transit in its various forms. Now, this has been rapidly worsening due to a really enormous increase in the share of vehicle sales as SUVs and trucks specifically. So you can see the chart on the left. These are vehicle sales in Canada from 2010 to 2021. And the top, like the dark blue, is so-called light trucks, so that's SUVs, trucks and minivans. And you can see the number of passenger cars, which will be more conventionally called cars, are reducing very significantly. And this matters for all sorts of reasons that we'll talk about, but one of them is definitely to do with greenhouse gas emissions, as you can see on the right. And there's a great deal of interest and enthusiasm for personal electric vehicles, and some of that's deserved, and we'll talk about that as well. But there's also an important dimension about global resource consumption that needs to be addressed when it comes to personal electric vehicles as a transition focus, including the mining of inputs that's largely done in indigenous territories of the global south. So this was a really interesting recent report that was done out of the States, led by a academic called Frankos, and they calculated what transition would look like specifically when it comes to lithium in terms of this worst case, status quo, optimistic best case, and focusing on reducing automobile-centric transportation systems reduces the amount of batteries that are required, and as you can see, there's a really stark difference in the amount of lithium, for example, that's required. And on the right, it kind of breaks that down to a minutia. Obviously, a Hummer is a very exaggerated example, but you can even see the difference between what a large vehicle versus a smaller one versus a large e-bike looks like. So yeah, electric buses require these vehicles as well, but as you can see, on a much more efficient and smaller scale, a lot of this just comes down to the number of people who can ride on a transit vehicle versus a personal car. At the max, a car can fit 5 people. Usually it's 1 to 2 people. And on a bus, it varies, but it can be up to 40 people sitting and another 20 to 30 people standing. So just in terms of the sheer efficiencies and the potentialities, there's a huge difference. And as has already been mentioned, there's also transit technologies that require even smaller batteries. So through the use of things like third rail, overhead wires, streetcars, trolley buses, all these things. And these technologies have existed for over a century. Most of them were ripped up. Actually, in Winnipeg, this past winter, we had eternal pothole road cracking problems, but the road cracked right down the middle to the point where streetcar rails, which had previously been paved over, were exposed again. So a lot of people took that as a sign from the transit god or something that we should be reinvested in that. So yeah, I argue that public transit is one of the most important climate and environmental solutions that we have. But it's largely not unsupported on this front. A lot of governments prefer to advance so-called market solutions like carbon pricing and EV subsidies, and there is a case to be made for these in certain situations. But I would argue that there's just a great deal more potential for climate and environment. Not only in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but as you can see on the right, also in terms of local air pollution. Private automobiles create a massive amount of air pollution, and this does include electric vehicles. While the engine created air pollution is obviously eliminated because of electric motors, you still get significant air pollution from brakes and tires. So I'll leave it there for now, but I will say that we have seen a huge upsurge in environmental organizations rallying behind transit in recent years. So this includes Climate Justice Edmonton and Free Transit Edmonton, Green Jobs Oshawa, Environment Hamilton, David Suzuki Foundation. So I just want to shout out those groups for really understanding and advancing this as a climate and environmental solution. This was just talked about by Mayor Sohi, but a second piece is the economic and racial justice aspect of automobility versus transit or other active transportation options. So as all of us who have owned or drive a car regularly know full well, it can be very expensive. So including the cost of purchase or leasing, fuel, maintenance, insurance, parking, depreciation. And arguably, I mean, it's not arguable, it's true. These huge costs are already huge costs are enormously subsidized by society through road building, healthcare costs, largely underpriced equal infrastructure, and so on. Yet most people are still forced to drive, as we saw in those charts earlier. And this is highly regressive for households spend a great deal more in terms of proportion on transportation costs than more affluent households. So this is a really serious economic and racial justice issue. Lack of transportation is also a massive impediment for people in terms of access to employment, food, healthcare, social and religious gatherings, recreation, and so much more. So this is a map of Toronto showing access to jobs by transit. And as you can see, the yellow is 200,000 jobs reachable within a 45-minute transit commute, and green is 150,000, light blue is 100,000, blue is 50,000. So access to serviceable transit makes such a difference in terms of people even having the ability to apply and be employed at certain jobs. And so not having access to transportation can predictably worsen so many outcomes. Poverty, malnutrition, poor health, social isolation. And this closely intersects with so many other oppressions that we know about, disproportionately impacting people who are racialized, poor, disabled, women, transgender, non-conforming, those who are too young or too old to drive, or those who are living in rural or remote areas. And we saw this play out in full force during COVID-19. So this is another map of Toronto. Sorry for all the Toronto content, but they do have a lot of good transit graphing. This was within the first couple of months, but Sean Marshall, who's a transit advocate there, documented where the overcrowding on TTC routes was happening, and it was overwhelmingly into industrial shift work areas. So a lot of like low-wage racialized workers were on routes which were perpetually overcrowded. So that's a huge public health issue. During COVID-19, the people who continued to take transit during the height of the pandemic really didn't have any other choice. So this is essential workers, healthcare, retail. It's people who rely on transit to get groceries, medical equipment, pharmacies, care work, all these sorts of things. And so this was a graph in Toronto that asked over 800 transit riders what it would mean, or why they continue to ride transit. And obviously the overwhelming answer was that giving it up would be too expensive. And the second one was giving up public transit would mean putting off or rescheduling medical trips. So there's really, really intense public health repercussions to this. And I don't think the answer to this is to provide everyone better incentives to buy a new electric vehicle. I think the answer is to provide genuine choice for people to use transit and active transportation by biking and walking. And this is a really essential requirement of advancing economic and racial justice in our cities. As Mayor Sonia said, basically every other improvement that we make in our cities is contingent on people being able to access them in the first place. So we can think about food deserts, we can think about, again, access to healthcare. We can make improvements in those areas if we have to, but unless people have easy access to them, there's going to be real impediments. So for our cities to be genuinely accessible and just, well-funded and prioritized public transit has to be at the very center, and relying on our mobility to resolve this crisis, I think, is quite naive and ignores as many intersecting factors that affect people's mobility. So the third issue and benefit that I'll touch on is congestion and safety. This is regarding traffic safety. I'll get to the other piece of safety later on. There's rarely the same level of scrutiny applied to the really devastating impacts on mobility, in which in Canada kills about 1,700 people a year and injures tens of thousands more. So I probably don't need to spend too much time on this, but this is also related to the harms and the frustrations of things like rush hour congestion, which is a huge blight on our cities that costs people huge amounts of time and fuel and money and mental health and so much more. And I will note that Winnipeg, where I'm from, is in the proud position of number 3 as the most congested city in Canada, which is quite the accomplishment. But you'll see that Edmonton is number 7, and the average commuter spends 135 hours in rush hour per year. So I think that this is another reason that we really have to make a case for building other kind of transportation systems. Sorry for including this graph. I know it's in like every year of this presentation. It's like a good one. You know, the problem's only really getting worse, and in contrast to the dreams that new road construction will free up space and reduce congestion, which a lot of people believe for some reason, it instead leads to induced demand and encourages more people to drive, and then any benefits really quickly evaporate. And as this photo kind of documents, this is really a purely geometric problem. There's just not enough space for everyone to drive. And this is especially true when it comes to parking, given cars are parked 95% of the day, and parked cars clog up simply massive amounts of space that could otherwise be used by many, many other things. So now I'm just going to quickly hop to the traffic safety piece. There has been a reduction in car-caused deaths over the past few decades in Canada, but it still has a staggering toll. As mentioned, it's 1,700 people die every year. And in many urban centers, there's been a marked increase of pedestrian and cyclist deaths, which is a trend intimately related to the increasing size and weight of vehicles, as mentioned before. And these harms are deeply intersected with questions like race and disability. So on the left, you can see the graph showing that in 2018, 41 pedestrians were killed in Toronto, and it's been hovering around that for the past few years. And on the right is an article that came out just yesterday in the city of Winnipeg, where the police chief blamed record death toll on what was called pandemic rage, which is just really heinous for reasons I hopefully will have to explain. This was raised earlier in a question. I do think it is a really interesting one. Again, we can get to the safety piece in a bit, but I do want to emphasize that transit crashes do happen, although many of them are with multi-private automobiles. But a key point here is that transit operators are professional drivers who do this for a living, like every day, day out. They have training, they have expertise, and every car driver is obviously convinced that they're the best driver in the world, but the reality is that many drive in pretty reckless ways, which I think is the result of a lot of different things in terms of built environment. But between the increased skill set of transit drivers and the removal of cars from the road, the transit has the potential to greatly increase the safety of transportation as a whole. So this is from the Victoria Transport Policy Institute, Todd Whitman, and he just has presented this as a way of thinking through transit safety in a way, because ultimately if everyone currently using transit moves towards automobiles, that's going to be more dangerous city for everyone. The last one is labor and good green jobs. And this is a really huge potential benefit of transit, although it may be seen as otherwise by some. But it's the enormous growth of good unionized green jobs available in transit. So this is operators, this is manufacturing, planning, design. It's the investments that can be made in buses, trains, streetcars, paratransit, all these things have the potential to really grow job creation in our cities. And I think if we're serious about that, if we're serious about, I know just transition's a bit of a loaded word, if we're serious about sustainable jobs, public transit should be at the forefront of our imaginations. So that was a really abbreviated version of what some of the arguments that make in the book, but really that these four harms of automobility can also be overcome through the potentiality of transit. So the next part of the presentation considers some of the things that are currently contributing to lack of transit usage, and some of them has already been covered today, so I won't spend as much time on certain sections as others, but I do think that repetition in this area is important because we do know why people don't ride transit. So the first is frequency, reliability, efficiency, coverage. This was a survey of 1,700 transit riders in New York by Transit Center in 2016. I don't know if it's but the main thrust of this is that a huge reason that people don't use transit is that they can't rely on it to get to work, appointments, or events, or retail, or even to show up at all. And there's some really important efforts to improve this on specific routes like high-frequency corridors and BRT lines. But in a lot of cities, transit systems still remain infrequent and unreliable, and there's poor coverage in certain areas. And it's difficult for people who don't live along these corridors to necessarily count on them. And it sounds like there's been some really amazing movements in off-peak, or like investments in off-peak, and that is so important because oftentimes we just like look quite exclusively at serving commuters between 9 to 5 or 8 to 6 or whatnot. But people want to use transit for so many other reasons. As mentioned, they want to use it to get to medical appointments, to get groceries, for recreation, leisure, just to ride around to get out of the house. So this is a really important aspect of it as well. And frequency does often get contrasted with coverage. Like it's like we can have frequent or we can have widely covered in terms of the suburbs. And I definitely agree, there's no question that suburban areas are far less suited to good public transit, which definitely benefits from density. But with that said, I do think it's still important and we should aspire to provide quality service in all areas of the city. And we should be striving to improve frequency, reliability, and coverage. And I know that as I say this, some people will be rolling their eyes and saying, like, okay, this is just like utopia. And this is what I hope to address in the third section, which is like, what is the major limitation and how can we work on it? So I honestly, if you are thinking that, rightfully so, just hopefully I can convince you in section 3. So the second reason is just like a lack of physical space dedicated to transit and active transportation. So this is a photo of TCC riders who we're going to be hearing from later on today. They did like a pop-up gorilla bus lane, basically, as a protest against the fact that there isn't sufficient dedicated space for transit. And so David talked earlier about the King Street pilot, about the streetcar being prioritized, and there are some really interesting results from that. Like one of them was that like car trips actually didn't get delayed by that much. It was like an extra 1 or 2 minutes in all the cases, but it greatly increased the reliability and efficiency of the streetcar routes. I know it's like not super popular necessarily, but like street space is a zero-sum game. Like every additional car on the road slows every other mode of transportation down, including buses and bikes and other cars. And it also makes it far more dangerous for pedestrians and cyclists, as we just talked about. And so in order for transit and other transportation modes to succeed, spaces, like physical space, needs to be taken away and reallocated from cars. I know that this is a really, that this is far from simple to do, and that, like, for example, the bike lane dividers on 102 Ave have already been like destroyed by Uber voters. And this is like, it's a very heated political site of contestation. So I don't want to like underestimate the difficulty of it, but if we want transit, if we want these other modes of transportation to succeed, it is really important to think about physical space and improving the efficiency of public transit. Okay, so the third one, this is also going to be a little bit controversial, but public ownership. Public transit should be publicly owned, funded, and operated. I think this is just like... This is a photo of the Confederation line in Ottawa, which I'm not sure if people really follow. It's just been like years of disaster, basically. This was a photo of a derailment, but they've also just had like many issues, like even as simple as like using a really cheap material in the stairs in a winter city, and so there's like slippage happening, just stuff like that. So P3 is public-private partnerships for infrastructure, including transit. They've been a major thing since the Harper era, but we're also seeing increased use, not P3s, but privatizations in the form of private contracts, things like on-demand, for paratransit, or contracting out of previously public jobs, like cleaning transit. And in some cases, not in Edmonton, elsewhere, we've seen public transit agencies directly contracting transit to ride-hailing companies like Uber and Lyft. And then there's, of course, a lot of private interest in bus services that have really come into the picture. Well, Greyhound is private, but we've seen a lot more public recently. So there's several reasons I think why we should be advocating for public ownership of transit services and infrastructures. Firstly, it helps keep revenues public and invested in improving service, reducing fares, and building quality infrastructure, not profiting investors. And I know there's been a lot of concern in Edmonton, including voiced by Mayor and Council, about what's happening with Valley Line and just lack of transparency in terms of like motors and such. And ultimately, even if it is built, the profits from that are going to be directed to the owners of it, not to Edmontonians and the rest of the service. Second is that it ensures that the service is provided regardless of profitability. And like transit's one of those things where you really need to be providing service over a span of years in order to build up ridership. And that's not always like very of interest to people who are private owners of things. They want fairly quick turnarounds, they want guaranteed profits, and especially when we're thinking about the equity use when we're providing transit service to low-income communities, there's not nearly as much of a guarantee of that sort of thing. It tends to provide better jobs, like good unionized green jobs, as we've already talked about. It cultivates in-house expertise and knowledge. The idea is that the transit agency can become the expert as opposed to having to continually and increasingly contract out to companies and consortiums, including the likes of Yellowstone and SNC Law and all these sorts of things. Like this should be knowledge and expertise developed by transit agencies. It gives far greater control and transparency. And then finally, it often costs less as well. There's been a lot of really interesting studies of P3 projects showing that over time, this is mostly in terms of hospitals and schools, but P3s can often cost way more because there's a desire for guaranteed profits, and also we can just see cost overruns and delays and all these sorts of things. So again, I know this is like clearly easier said than done, especially for municipalities that face really significant constraints on financial revenue generation, but I don't think that this justifies privatizations, and that our movements must fight to keep transit public and for future transit projects to be public. Okay, number 4 is cheaper or free transit. So another big aspect of transit and of ridership is fares. So it's really great that Edmonton has frozen fares for a bit. But in a lot of other places, despite stagnating or declining service, fares in many cities continue to increase year after year. And transit price elasticities is a really complicated thing with a lot of variables. I don't have time, and I don't think anyone has the interest in really getting into that now, but we can say generally that increasing fares can depress transit usage. So research by Todd Lippman again suggests that for every 1% increase in fares, there's a 0.2 to 0.5 decrease in the short term of ridership and 0.6 to 0.9% in the long term. And what is happening is that people find different ways of getting around, or they simply don't take trips altogether. And these effects are especially pronounced when combined with other policies like service cuts. So fare increases mean that riders are reminded of this every single trip they take. It's just sort of like, for some, it can just be like a daily thing, or multiple times a day. And driving is obviously so much more expensive in total, but I think even just like the relations of like gas fill-ups tending to only happen once a week or so, repair and maintenance happening once every 6 months or a year, the fare increases manifest daily or several times a day. And I think that they can really cement sort of a resentment about what is going on. And low-income fare subsidies can definitely help, and there's good progress on that in a lot of cities, but they can still be too expensive or bureaucratic for some. So there are people being left out of this. Although the 1900 free transit passes being distributed is like awesome. I think we're supposed to do that. This is a big one for me. Removing fares can also make transit safer. So I'll talk about this in a bit, but one of the leading causes of conflict with drivers is fare disputes. And I'll talk about that more later. But it can also make boarding more efficient because you don't have to wait for people to tap. I know tap is more efficient than putting points in the thing. But it also removes the need for costly and invasive and racialized enforcement. So this is an image of, it's in Dunkirk, France. They made it transit free a couple of years ago. And it shows that of 2,000 residents surveyed, 50% of them were new users, and about 48% of those left their cars behind, which is a great accomplishment. And critics of free transit, which there are many, are correct in noting that people will not take free transit if the bus does not show up, if it's not reliable or frequent enough to rely on. But as with other things I've talked about, I do genuinely think we can have and we should struggle for both things. That we deserve, that we should fight for cheaper or free transit and high quality service. We've seen cities implement fare reductions to incentivize ridership and they often work really well. So in terms of, like, it's not the only issue, and I think free transit can get caricatured as like, oh, you only care about fares, to say nothing of the implication that we're just going to like remove this source of revenue and hope things work out. That's really not the demand, and I'll get into that in section 3. Okay, number 5 is thinking about transit as like an expansive citywide service. So this includes things like snow clearing, bus shelters, ramps, cycling infrastructure. I think it's really essential for transit to be understood in a way where it's, and we've already heard conversations about this today, so I'm not pretending this is like a novel James Wilt exclusive. But it's really about including the ease of accessing boarding and transfers and the so-called first and last mile problem. Because if people can't easily access or comfortably wait for transit, they're way less likely to use it, or if they can help it. But the other piece is that we also have to think about this as a basic quality of life and respect for riders with different needs. This includes people who are disabled, people who are elderly, people who use a mobility aid, or parents with a stroller. And this, in terms of demands, means excellent sidewalks, snow removal, and ice control. It means bus shelters and benches that are heated in the winter and cooled in the summer. It means public washrooms. It means drinking fountains. It means functioning ramps and elevators. And many cities in Canada are failing at this in really quite catastrophic ways. So these three examples are from Winnipeg, where I'm from. Sidewalk clearing is disastrous. Bus stops are frequently inaccessible to people with disabilities. There's really profound divisions in the quality of infrastructure, just accessible to people. And so the middle one is my favorite. Not my favorite, it's horrible. This past winter, a number of cyclists got really disgruntled, and as an act of protest, began to shovel the bike lanes themselves, as a political act. And then the city of Winnipeg responded by threatening to fine them for doing that. So that's kind of a worst case scenario, but I think all of these things add up. If someone slips and falls and breaks their arm, or that happens once or twice, 3 times, it can really deter one's desire to use transit in a spontaneous way. And then, of course, as has been discussed today, quality cycling infrastructure, pedestrian infrastructure is a huge addition to transit systems. So bike walkers extension is a big one for sure. I know regional transit is also a loaded thing here, but another reason that I think some people like to own and rely on cars is for trips outside of the city. So this can be to visit family, friends in rural areas. It can be to take road trips. It can be to get out of town. And this is especially true for rollouts and automobility in the context of the collapse of intercity bus lines like the Saskatchewan Transportation Company, which is a Crown Corp, and even Greyhounds, first throughout Western Canada and throughout the rest of the country. And there have been some private lines, but many of them offer limited service, and we've also seen plenty of them go under in recent years. So on the left is a map of what was the Saskatchewan Transportation Company, and I include that just as an example of the coverage, which was really remarkable. And it also provided a really important freight service, which we only really learned about after the closure of it. So these services are important for a lot of reasons, but especially for people in rural and remote areas, it gives far greater access to things like healthcare, community, recreation, and it also means that people in urban areas can get out of town for a while. And I don't want to understate the difficulty of establishing these kind of networks. I know Edmonton has gone through this, and I think the part around regional transfers is a really important step. But I think this is also where we need far greater leadership at higher levels of government, which are, I think, much better positioned to be planning these kind of things in collaboration with municipalities. And so, as one example of what this could look like, this is a pretty specific example, but BC Transit, which is a regional transit system in BC, actually established a bus network along Highway 16, also known as the Highway of Tears, in collaboration with local First Nations. And there's issues, it's privatized and there's frequency issues, but it has seen really significant ridership and given people safe means of transportation. It's a really important intervention in terms of providing people transportation who would otherwise hitchhike and be exposed to really dangerous situations. I'll also note, I don't have a nice photo of this, but we do need to be fighting for passenger rail as well, including the funding and the prioritization of the rail. And honestly, I love the idea of high-speed rail, but frankly, I don't even know if it has to be high-speed to succeed, at least at this point. We just need reliable and affordable rail. I would have taken Via Rail to Edmonton if I could have known that I would get here when I was scheduled to get here. But because they have to compete for track space with CN and the major rail companies, there's just no predictability when it comes to that. Okay, this brings us to the topic of the hour and the day, which is safety. And I know it's obviously a very major issue in Edmonton and across Canada. Violence or threats of violence, or harassment, or anything like that can be an extremely visceral and a very clear deterrent to using transit. So people can have a single bad incident and avoid taking transit again or not return to that area. So this is what they call like a heat map. It's a Safe Cities Action Plan in London, Ontario, where women identified as feeling safe and unsafe. So you can this isn't specific to transit, but I think just like the way that we can see how certain areas are just understood to be less safe than others, and that it will inform people's decision to navigate the city in certain ways. We also need to be clear about who has always been most at risk of experiencing violence or harassment. So this is women, trans, and gender non-conforming people. This is Indigenous, Black, and racialized people. This is people with disabilities, people who are unhoused or in highly precarious situations. So when we're thinking about safety, what it means to be safe, we have to ensure that this safety is all-encompassing, that it includes everyone, because all these people are Edmontonians as well. They are all fellow transit riders and users. So, as mentioned, people who have been victims of violence will navigate transit systems if they return to transit in completely different ways, using certain lines or stations at certain times of days, avoiding using transit at night, if at all. And complexity has been the word of the day, and it is a really big and complex issue, and I doubt that I will be able to provide a true satisfactory answer for everyone. There's really no silver bullet solution, but I do think that there's some important things that we can think about on several levels in terms of how better transit service itself can create better safety. So on the left is like a recent Twitter thread of someone from Winnipeg that went quite viral, and their account is private, but I asked for permission to share this. And I'll just read it out for people. She says, as someone who has been riding public transit consistently for a decade, and I'm one thing would make me feel safer as more frequent service, not transit cops, here's why. I've been in several situations where people have become agitated on the bus and I debated getting off. Many times I stayed on because I knew that the next bus wouldn't come for another 15 to 20 minutes and I'd be late to work. The lack of frequency is also why I avoid busing at night. It's risky to stay by myself at a stop for upwards of 10 minutes in the dark. Being able to get off between stops at night is great, but I don't think it solves the underlying issue. So I think it's really important when we're thinking about safety, and we have to be thinking about safety, is that what does it mean for transit to be high quality and for there to be frequency, reliability, efficiency, coverage, and how does that itself promote safety? And how does it mean that in this situation, that if a conflict happens, that someone can get off the bus and know that there will be another bus within 10 minutes and that they won't be late to work? That's a calculation that people shouldn't have to make. On the right is what I alluded to earlier, and this is in regards to cheaper or free fares. There have been reports across Canada and North America that fare disputes are one of the leading causes of assaulting drivers. It's obviously not the only one. I'm not trying to reduce it to this as being like a silver bullet solution. But by reducing or eliminating fares, by ensuring that bus drivers, that transit operators don't have to play the role of tax collector and put themselves in those situations, we can remove a significant source of conflict. So again, when we're thinking about safety, we need to be thinking about fares. I know that this is not the most popular way or the most intuitive way of approaching this, but I don't think that we can be addressing this question without it. So lastly, better transit means that more people will use it. So this itself has a beneficial effect as people can look out for each other, especially if they are trained and if there's public campaigns to really inspire people to step up for each other. Lack of ridership and isolation can lead to violence and predation. But at the same time, transit needs to be not so overcrowded that people can't safely distance and that people can harass or attack and just disappear. So it is a really fine balance. We need transit service to be excellent on every level, and that itself is a safety solution. But transit service itself is not enough, and there are really acute situations of violence occurring that require much broader responses. And what I will say for now, and we can talk about this in the breakout session at length, probably, is that enforcement, displacement, incarceration, it doesn't solve the issues that culminate in violence. So we know that security and enforcement is deeply racialized and classed in character, and what may feel like safety for some can mean a significant reduction in safety for others. So once again, the presence of a certain type of person who is a like an enforcement officer may make someone feel safe, but may make someone else feel radically less safe. So we have to ensure that our fight for transit safety, which is of the utmost importance, is not coming at the cost of riders from across communities who are also, again, also Edmontonians. They are also riders. They also deserve safety. And so we have to constantly reflect on whether situations are genuinely unsafe or simply uncomfortable. And a feeling that can be related to so many different things that I do not have time to get into now. So many of the crises manifested in public space, and as David pointed out, I think really helpfully, is that during COVID-19 especially, public transit became one of the last remaining public spaces that people can congregate. For a lot of really rational reasons, like if you are forced to stay in an emergency shelter and there's a COVID-19 outbreak, or there's some sort of situation where you don't want to be there, going to a transit station makes perfect rational sense. And so what addresses this, as has been mentioned time and time again, is ensuring that everyone has their basic needs met. So this means housing, food, income, healthcare, so much more. We can't think about safety outside of that context. And if we do, it results in short-term, ineffective responses that only worsen the situation. There's a transit advocate in Winnipeg named Kyle Owens of Functional Transit Winnipeg, and he had this really great quote, which I have been referencing a lot. He said that transit isn't the storm, transit is the weather vane telling us that there's a problem. There's another more specific piece, and there's been a lot of discourse around public consumption of criminalized drugs at transit stations that make people feel unsafe. This led to the canceling of a program in Edmonton distributing essential harm reduction supplies. But again, ending this program does not resolve the problem. It doesn't mean that people aren't going to use criminalized drugs. It merely displaces it to less visible locations. And I understand that people who are riding transit, people who are working in transit, do not have to want to deal with that situation. But the reality is that it doesn't resolve it. So the answer to that, it's not more displacement, it's safe consumption sites, and it's a legal and regulated safe supply of drugs. It's ensuring that people know what substances that they're taking and have the support they need to survive if something goes wrong. And this may seem so far beyond the domain of transit, but it is inextricably linked. If we really want to address the issue of transit safety, we have to expand our conceptions of what makes a city safe for all. And of course, in the meantime, people should continue to have access to harm reduction supplies. Suspending this for the sake of safety means a radical reduction in safety for others. And lastly, I'll just say that there is absolutely a room for crisis. There's absolutely room, not a room, for crisis response. And again, being from Winnipeg, these are what come to mind. But there's really amazing examples of peer-led services and responses that are grounded in experiences and knowledges of mental health and de-escalation through relationships. These are Indigenous-led street patrols. So the one on the left is called Mama Bear Plan. And the one on the right is a community safety host program, which has been developed at Millennium Library, which is the downtown library. These are largely Indigenous people with lived experience of these sorts of situations. And so it's providing a type of security, but it is grounded in a far different set of principles than often what we think about when it comes to security. There's also obviously a need for targeted PSA campaigns, for bystander intervention training, for built environments that will create safety, safe walk home programs. I've also been thinking a lot about intervention campaigns around gender violence. So there's a great program at Calgary Center for Sexuality called Wise Guys. It works with boys in grade 9, and it starts to get them thinking about what it means to be in healthy relationships and have respect for other people. And again, this may not seem like it is taking these acute situations seriously enough, but I think if we really want long-term safety in our cities, these are the kind of things we need to be thinking about. We also need just more transit staff, at terminals, at stations. They can be doing wayfinding, they can be distributing COVID supplies, they can be doing so many different things. Just having a presence, I think, can help a lot. And then the last thing I would say on this is that, just to reiterate, that we need to think a lot more broadly about what constitutes a safety issue. Drug poisoning deaths are a safety issue. COVID-19 is a safety issue. 1,700 people dying every year in car crashes is a safety issue. Disabled people not being able to leave their houses is a safety issue. Evictions and encampment destruction is a safety issue. And when I say this is not to distract from the real issues on transit, but it's just to emphasize that certain discourses are getting certain amounts of emphasis compared to others, and that safety relating to transit mobility takes many forms. And that when we're fighting for better transit safety, we just have to take a really holistic and wide-ranging approach to it. So the last thing I'll say is just that safety really has to be addressed through long-term preventative strategies rather than reactive punishment and displacement. So those are some of the major factors that limiting transit usage. There are others that I don't want to touch on. This is one of my favorite recent ones, where cities will just like pay drivers to give up their car, or give free public transit, or give compensation towards transit passes. I think that that's just like a really cool and exciting idea, especially given just the sheer cost of mobility. So I'm sure that many of you have been thinking basically this whole time, like, this sounds great, like, it's all really nice, but like, where is this money going to come from? Like, how are we going to do this? I think it's an extremely legitimate question, and this final section will take a quick look at transit funding, and I think what we should be focusing on in order to build up transit. So transit agencies rely really heavily on fare revenue to fund operations, and this reliance does vary a great deal from city to city. It's generally between 1/3 and 2/3 of revenue. These numbers are from 2018 to 19. So in that era, Edmonton was 45%. It's gone down quite a bit because of COVID. But the remainder tends to be funded by municipal property taxes and very modest grants from the country government. So municipalities are very constrained when it comes to revenue generation, has been discussed today. It was really interesting to hear about what Vancouver does. I think there's a lot of potential there. This is from Edmonton's budget. You can see that, actually I don't even know if you can see, it's kind of blurry. But property tax makes up almost 2/3 of on-source revenues, but it's also interesting when you compare it to the bottom graph, which is the amount that each household pays to each government sector, is that the property tax makes up a minuscule percentage. A far greater amount goes to federal income tax and provincial income tax. Actually, there's one more thing, is that if and when cities do try to reduce budgets of other departments, provinces often intervene to block it. And a lot of this relates to just the political nature of municipalities, in which for the most part they're creatures of the provinces. And so this doesn't mean that municipalities don't have any power, but there are a lot of limitations on it. So this is all very relevant to transit. So higher levels of government are more than happy to fund big capital projects like LRT lines, because they can cut a ribbon in front of it, because it's really good to have on campaign literature and that sort of thing. But outside of crisis situations like COVID, they categorically refuse to fund operations. There are exceptions to this, but for the most part, the emergency fundings that we saw recently are fairly unprecedented. So this means that the actual costs of running transit, so this is mostly hiring and paying the workers to maintain and operate and clean and administer transit, is overwhelmingly downloaded onto municipalities, and in turn it's downloaded onto providers through fares. And so this can be perfectly functional for maintaining and improving marginally existing levels of service, but what I argue is it largely impedes significant improvements to service, the things that we've been talking about today, to respond to a climate crisis with a massive escalation of transit service and such. And there's exceptions to this when you have LRT projects come online, but typically service levels are maintained at best. And it's especially worth noting that bus service tends to be specifically underfunded, which results in pass-ups and delays and ridership loss. So what this means is that the only options available are, I shouldn't say the only, the few options available to transit services are oftentimes streamlining and fine-tuning existing services. So the recent bus network redesign, it's a great project, and I think that every city should kind of take on that approach to update it, because so much has changed when bus networks were first designed. These approaches are useful and they can help in a lot of ways, but a lot of the time it's marketed as doing more with the same amount of funding. And I'm not against this, but it can only do so much. We really need to be pushing for far more funding. And loss of ridership especially can be worsened by municipalities through service cuts. And this is a situation which has been described as a vicious or a violent cycle or circle. There's a lot of variations. But most recently, Toronto decided to cut TTC service by 5% while hiking fares at the same time. So that's a really poor response to what's going on. So before concluding with what I think should be done about it, I just want to offer a brief aside. Critics of transit will often note that transit is heavily subsidized by society, and this varies based on city, but again, between 1/3 and 2/3 of systems, or 1/3 of 2/3 system revenue is based on fares, and the remainder comes from society for sure. But it's also essential to understand that automobility costs far, far more. So yes, drivers pay a nominal fee via the gas tax, which is in jeopardy because of electrification, as well as through things like toll roads. And for what it's worth, the gas tax has not covered the cost of roads for a very long time. And then there's the privatized cost of driving, of course, that have already been discussed. But the cost of driving continues to be really heavily subsidized by society. And then there's the indirect costs, which are documented in this. So this is the healthcare costs, the ecological costs, the cost of safety of other people. And I know this because it's not a decision between the status quo of no cost and the cost of transit. It's between an extremely expensive existing system of private automobility and the alternative of transit and active transportation infrastructure. And yes, transit costs money. Of course it costs money. But the system that we have right now costs a whole lot more money. So this is an interesting project out of Vancouver specifically, and it's not universally applicable to every city, but it just sort of illustrates how we can think about this in a different way, which I think can be quite useful. So back to the point at hand, where is all this money going to come from? So as much as possible, I think a municipality should work to redirect funds from roads, transit, and active transportation. I know that this isn't easy because a lot of grants are conditional on spending on roads. So the province or the feds will open up certain amounts, massive amounts of money, if it's to build a highway or a road or that sort of thing. But these conditions are changing, parameters are being updated, and we should continue to strongly oppose new road construction in a climate catastrophe. We need that money for transit operations, especially for reduced demand. And in cases where there's desire to reallocate money to transit from other city departments, I think city councils need to be working to build constituencies of support through things like town halls, things like this, targeted outreach, coalition building. And again, I don't want to undermine I don't want to understate the difficulty of this fight, but to build great transit, we need to take away funding and prioritization of private vehicles. And so this was a protest in the mid-60s in the DC region. I just really like it because even back then, well, of course back then, they knew that freeways were destroying the city and they wanted that money to be allocated to rapid transit. We also need to be mounting far more pressure on the provincial and federal governments to commit to long-term operating funding for transit. This one is really, really big. So this is an example of TTC riders, which we'll be hearing from shortly, in their work with the Keep Transit Moving Coalition, where they're calling on federal parties to commit to permanent transit operations funding. And so this may seem, again, like a long shot given who's presently in power in Alberta, but we do have elections coming up across the country. This is a key demand to take to aspiring leaders. Like, if you call yourself a climate leader, are you going to commit to long-term operating funding to actually improve the service of transit? And there's recent precedent for this, like through the Federal Safe Restart Agreement and similar collaborations. Just a couple of days ago, the BC government, to their credit, invested, I think it was almost $500 million in transit, which is Vancouver's service, like explicitly for operating funding. So it is entirely possible. It's just about political will and desire for transit to actually succeed, not just to be maintained at present levels. So if these governments want to pretend to care about things like climate change and racial equality, then they need to commit to funding transit operations and not just infrastructure. Because ultimately, like, if we build beautiful, great infrastructure, but we don't have the operations funds to actually hire the workers to operate it, then what's the point? That was actually the demand from ATU Canada President John Dino during the pandemic, was to reallocate the $5 billion that was going into capital projects into operations. That was his line. It was like, why are we talking about building new capital projects when we can't even run just like operations on existing lines? So there's also no question in my mind, again, this response to something that was raised earlier, that provinces and federal governments have way more room for taxation than they are currently capitalized on. And this starts, I think, to connect dots between various movements, which we have to continue to do. Is that, the feds continue to invest in massive fossil fuel projects. TMX is now costing $31 million. That's just like a staggering amount of money. And I think that this is at a time that all the science shows that we should be winding down oil and gas production. So in this sense, it's an extremely obvious move to me to demand that such money and profits be taxed and invested in things like transit operations, along with many other things that we need for a genuine and just transition. I'll just also note that on the right, the reports are $35 billion of profits and costs. I know that Edmonton's small town, I know that Alberta's a small province. These are difficult conversations, but there is a lot of money which is not being collected that could be used to fund transit. I'm sure there'll be disagreements on the particulars, but there's no doubt that we can be collecting far more than we currently are. The final thing I'll say is at the level of political organizing, there's really massive potential, I think, for transit riders and workers to be mobilized to demand these kind of things. Riders and workers are the most aware of these problems with transit systems. And anytime I ride transit, I will hear people complaining about the state of service or about rising fares or whatever. And at an organizing level, we also know that riders inevitably concentrate physically at stations and shelters, which presents a really amazing outreach opportunity. So the group TTC Riders in Toronto have really powerfully demonstrated this. But this is a photo of Chris Smalls in the Amazon Union in the US, in which the bus stop by the Amazon warehouse was a key site of outreach. He talks about how he was at the bus stop every day for 300 days straight, outreaching to workers. And it was only through that outreach. And of course, this wasn't like a transit struggle, but at the same time, it kind of was a transit struggle. So I think if there's a coherent movement and a set of actions for people to take, there's a lot of potential to advance this cause collectively. Transit riders also have a lot of specific power. And we think of workers going on a strike, of course, but there's also there's a long history of transit workers doing fair strikes as an act of in terms of escalating labor action. But there's also a group called Bus Riders Union in LA. This was in the 90s. And they had this campaign called No Seat, No Fare. And it was specifically to protest the overcrowding and the polluting nature of buses. And so, I don't know if you can see it, but it talks about talking to the workers, that the campaign is aimed at the discrimination against bus riders. It's not against the transit workers themselves. So it's trying to build coalitions between transit riders and workers, but it's also trying to use the power of transit riders themselves. That if there's no seat, we're not going to pay, this sort of thing. So to engage in that, I think, is really interesting. And then we can also learn a lot from the physical contesting of street space to a lot of really creative means. So top left is obviously a protest against just the amount of space that car parking takes up. So people set up tents that are car-sized, and we'll just hang out in them as a protest. Bottom left is critical mass, which is an amazing, legendary bike activist movement, which has existed for decades, but this is taking the streets collectively. It's beyond a bike jam. It's intentionally a political act of reclaiming space. And then the one on the right is cyclists building these contraptions that are the size of cars to again, it's a political act of trying to take back street space. So again, not pretending that anything any of these are easy. The critical mass has been coming back in Winnipeg for the past year, and it's an intense thing to be a part of. Drivers do get really angry. So it's it's not. I'm not presenting these as silver bullets. I'm just saying that we have things to learn from. That there's a history of these sorts of struggles. So I know I've talked a great deal. There's likely questions, or what I'm more interested in is insights about things that I've brought up. But just to reiterate the three sort of major themes of this is that, firstly, transit offers massive potential to advance the goals of things like climate and environment, economic and racial justice, reducing congestion and improving safety, and labor and good green unionized jobs. these are things that we should be fighting for on principle. Secondly, there's many deterrents of transit use that we can address. Frequency, reliability, efficiency, coverage, dedicated road space, public ownership, cheaper or free fares, better contextual services, so those are things like snow clearing and bus shelters, regional and inner-city service, and then long-lasting transit safety. And then finally, I argue that to win these advancements and improvements, we need to focus especially on operating funding. We of course need capital projects, we need the BRT lines, we need the LRT lines, but we need the money to hire the operators, to hire the cleaners, to hire the people to maintain the vehicles. We need transit, not more roads or private vehicles. We need higher levels of government to commit to long-term. We need to tie demands to broader struggles for justice, and we need to take advantage of the spatial and geographic political nature for transit organizing. So thanks to everyone for listening, for all the people and organizations who have worked incredibly hard to put this event on. And I'm looking forward to more conversations and strategizing together. I am with these two slides because I always love these kind of pictures. The one on the left is San Francisco, the one on the right is Amsterdam. And it shows the way that these cities have changed on the left, it's in the period of a decade or 2 decades, and on the right, the first one is like a century ago. But then you can see the influx of cars and then the return of it to a different kind of street space. And these happen through political struggle. Like Amsterdam used to be like a very car-centric city, and now it's considered to be one of like sort of the bike utopias of the world. And again, it's not just because people in Amsterdam are people in Amsterdam. Like, it's not because of some sort of cultural ideological bias. It was through political struggle, and that's why I really want to emphasize today. And then hopefully then we'll continue to talk about, and then we'll hear from Sheila at TTC Riders as well. But that's it for me. Thank you so much for listening.